Most of you will know that I have been on sabbatical. Thank you very much. And the thing that I am studying and will be studying for several years to come, all being well, is really how we describe what it means to grow and become Christ-like. The word Christian means little Christ. How can we talk about what it means, not just to pray the prayer and identify ourselves as a Christian, but to keep becoming the person that we can be? And it's very difficult to describe because it can't be a list of things, because we all start from very, very different places. And for some of us, that list of things is just kind of who we are. It's not actually the best that we can be. If we've been given certain privileges in life, then some things come easy to us that are hard for others. So I'm trying to find a way to describe being a mature, growing person that isn't just a list of things to tick, but more a way of being and a way of growing from wherever we are. And one of the things that I've been studying is this field which is called neurotheology, which is really the interface between faith and brain science. And a few years ago, there was a book published called Thinking Fast and Slow, which I referenced a bit before Christmas. And the really, really short way of talking about how this book affects us as Christians is, I think we probably all know that reading Bible verses telling us not to get angry doesn't stop us from getting angry. And we all do things that we know that we shouldn't. And Paul goes on about that at great length. I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I do want to do. That there is what neuroscientists call the fast part of the brain, or the chimp brain, or the lizard brain. You might have heard these terms. There are instinctive parts of us that react very, very fast. The fight or flight or freeze kind of defense mechanism happens very, very quickly before our brain, the slow part of our brain, goes, what should I do? What would be the most sensible thing to do? What would be the godly thing to do in this situation? So if we really want to change and become a new person, we have to change that deep inner person and not just think about what the right thing to do is. I'm not saying that we shouldn't read the scriptures. I'm not saying that we shouldn't study ethics, but actually the deep innermost person has to be transformed, not just thinking good thoughts. And that's a lot harder to do. And just in the last few weeks, while I was having COVID, I started listening to a podcast about some of these subjects. So I probably experienced it in a slightly hallucinogenic way. So it may, but I listened to a particular neurotheologian talking about how so much of our faith is built on this idea of having a relationship with God. And it's just assumed that we all know how to have a relationship. But actually, for many of us, things go wrong, perhaps early in our lives. And that time of life, there's this whole way of talking about attachment. Do we learn how to have healthy, loving and trusting relationships with other people? Or maybe we have experiences later in life that affect our ability to have a relationship. So for some of us, trusting God, for example, is really easy. But for others, it's not so easy, because our trust in the world has been broken by experiences, either ones that have happened that we can remember, or possibly things that have happened in a time that we can't remember. And that's even worse because we don't really know why we have this lack of trust in the world around us and in God. And as I was listening to this podcast, I was reminded of what now seems quite a sensible thing to do, which is to think about what it means that Jesus called God Abba. I've said before, it really annoys me that a Swedish band won the Eurovision Song Contest in the 1970s, because it's very difficult to talk about ABBA. But one of the most revolutionary things that Jesus did within his context, which we have to remember was a world in which the name of God couldn't be spoken out loud. It had to be written without vowels in the Hebrew scriptures, that Jesus was so familiar with God that he used the familiar name of Father in the Aramaic language. And that has been handed on down to us. Even though the New Testament was written in Greek, those writers wanted us to know that this was the word that Jesus used to describe God, because it was so revolutionary, a relationship of trust and love and intimacy. And that is part of our gospel. It seems completely normal and obvious, but for the next few weeks, we're going to try to approach this notion of approaching God as Abba through one of the most famous stories in the Bible. So Annie's going to read it to us. You'll know it so well. So I ask you perhaps to kind of let it flow over you and just ask yourself, what can I hear from this story that I haven't noticed before? Try not to switch off, because your first thought will be, I know this story off by heart. But just see what you notice that maybe you haven't noticed before. Annie, thank you. I'm going to ask you now to read our gospel reading.
Yeah, so this is Luke 15, 11 to 32. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am, starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and is now found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the elder son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come home,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," said the father, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is now found."
Brilliant, thank you. That story is really well known to us. It's almost second nature if you've grown up in the church. It's part of the symbolic language. For that reason, I'm going to ask Anna, who's with her mum, to give us a more contemporary. It's not a retelling of this story because this is a true story. When I said that the reading that I've been doing was reminding me of a time in the church where we really focused on God, well, the book that everyone read at the time was a book called The Father Heart of God by Floyd McClung. And there's a story in that book which always stayed with me. And I'm going to ask Anna to read that now. So it's a little bit, it's a little bit longer than what we've just heard, but not much. And it is very much a story for our times.
So this is called The Waiting Father. Sawat had disgraced his family and dishonoured his father's name. He'd come to Bangkok to escape the dullness of village life. He'd found excitement, and while he prospered in his sordid lifestyle, he found popularity as well. When he first arrived, he visited a hotel unlike any he had ever seen. Every room had a window facing into the hallway, and in every room sat a girl. The older ones smiled and laughed. Others, just 12 or 13 years old or younger, looked nervous, even frightened. That visit began Sawat's venture into Bangkok's world of prostitution. It began innocently enough, but he was quickly caught like a small piece of wood in a raging river. Its force was too powerful and swift for him, the current too strong. Soon he was selling opium to customers and propositioning tourists in the hotels. He even went so low as to actually buy help and sell young girls, some of them only 9 and 10 years old. It was a nasty business, and he was one of the most important of the young businessmen. Then the bottom dropped out of his world. He hit a string of bad luck. He was robbed, and while trying to climb back to the top, he was arrested. The word went out in the underworld that he was a police spy. He finally ended up living in a shanty by the city trash pile. Sitting in his little shack, he thought about his family, especially his father, a simple Christian man from a small southern village near the Malaysian border. He remembered his dad's parting words, "I'm waiting for you." He wondered whether his father would still be waiting for him after all he'd done to dishonour the family name. Would he be welcome in his home? Word of Sawat's lifestyle had long ago filtered back to the village. Finally, he devised a plan. "Dear father," he wrote, "I want to come home, but I don't know if you will receive me after all that I have done. I've sinned greatly, father. Please forgive me. On Saturday night, I will be on the train that goes through our village. If you are still waiting for me, will you tie a piece of cloth on the po tree in front of our house? Sawat." On that train ride, he reflected on his life over the past few months and knew that his father had every right to deny him. As the train finally neared the village, he churned with anxiety. What would he do if there was no white cloth on the Poe tree? Sitting opposite him was a kind stranger who noticed how nervous his fellow passenger had become. Finally, Samut could stand the pressure no longer. He blurted out his story in a torrent of words. As they entered the village, Samut said, "Oh, sir, I cannot bear to look. Can you watch for me? What if my father will not receive me back?" Samut buried his face between his knees. "Do you see it, sir? It's the only house with a Poe tree." "Young man, your father did not just hang one piece of cloth. Look, he's covered the whole tree with cloth." Samut could hardly believe his eyes. The branches were laden with tiny white squares. In the front yard, his old father jumped up and down, joyously waving a piece of white cloth, then ran in halting steps beside the train. When it stopped at the little station, he threw his arms around his son, embracing him with tears of joy. "I've been waiting for you," he exclaimed.
I had to ask Anna to read that because it gets me every time. It's difficult to read a story that we know so well and see something new in it. But one of the amazing things about the Gospels is that we know that these stories were told orally first. We can see from the way that the Gospels were constructed that particular emphasis was made on perfectly memorizing and copying the words of Jesus. So the words that we read here, which are a story that Jesus told, we can be sure that they have great meaning, and that what seem like strange and extraneous details are not there by accident. They've been held on to and passed on to us for a reason. I don't mean that in a kind of, oh, you know, the Holy Spirit. I just mean this is a story that was told and it was passed on, and we can trust that in a different world to ours, the story was remembered well. If we were living 800 years ago, the way that these stories were read was very different, and people would be used to hearing the great preachers of the time saying, "Oh, you know, the cloak means this, and the ring means this, and the pig's food, you know, means this." We don't generally preach like that in our day and age, but that's part of our heritage. And today I'm going to do a little bit of that, and this short series that we're going to do for the next couple of months is going to delve into this story in particular, and look at some of the elements of the story. You will probably know, if you've ever heard a sermon on this story with a PowerPoint presentation, you've probably seen Rembrandt's The Return of the Prodigal Son before. This isn't the whole picture. There is a woman in the top left that you can't really see, who is probably the mother. It's not 100% clear who these characters are that are there with the father and the son. But this painting is so moving and significant for Rembrandt as a person who came to identify himself with the prodigal son. And the writer, Henry Nouwen, wrote an amazing book called The Return of the Prodigal Son, which I would highly recommend. And it's an opportunity to wonder, you know, where we might be. We're going to get into great depth in the story, so I want to talk quite quickly about where we're going, which is to identify the 5 things that the father gives the son. And they are first of all, an embrace. I'm a hugger, so in that sense, hugs don't carry great symbolism for me. And having visited the Near East and other parts of the world, men hugging is not such a big deal as it is in this culture. But nonetheless, the hug represents the reconciliation that story of Sawat reminds us of, that this was not the expected result. This was not the expected end of a story in which a son dishonors his father and wastes the family resources. And it addresses one of those deep down issues that we struggle with, which is that we are unworthy, that we are unlovable, that we are somehow faulty, and that somehow the love of God is not enough for us. We hear the gospel of forgiveness, and yet we rather foolishly say, yes, but I'm especially unlovable. And the embrace is the symbol of God's unconditional love that overcomes whatever unworthiness we might feel. And this is the Speaker of a House wearing his ceremonial garbs. In the Rembrandt picture, the father and one of the other characters, we're not completely sure who that represents, is wearing a very, very luxurious, expensive robe. And yet, the first thing that the father does is take off his robe. We can assume that this is a story about a wealthy family. They have animals, they have land. The father can afford to give away half of his land and still live sustainably. But the next thing that the father does is give the son his robe, which would have been perhaps not as significant as the robe of the Speaker of the House, but nonetheless a symbol of his wealth, his power, his position in society. And the next thing that the father says to his son is, you are enough. You are valuable. You have everything that I have. My mantle, my robe belongs on you. You are not a second-class citizen. You are good enough. The next thing, even more symbolic, and perhaps the thing that would have upset the other brother more than anything else, is that the father puts his ring on the son. And if you've ever watched a historic movie, there's always that point in which something is written on a scroll and then wax is poured on it, and the duke or the lord or the king uses their ring to mark the seal, to prove that it has the authority of the nobleman or the king. And that's an amazingly symbolic thing that the father does. One of those deep things, that voices that we have inside us, is I'm powerless. My life is out of control. I can't change things. Things just happen to me. Whereas here the father says to the child, no, you have my authority. You can live as one who has the authority of the king given to them. These are some sandals from the fort of Masada, which was besieged by the Romans in AD 70. So when the story says the father gave the son some sandals, this is what we're talking about. But sandals were not worn by everyone. they Roman soldiers got the best sandals because they had to march so far, but probably the servants of the Father would have had to work without sandals. So the provision of the sandals in our scheme represents inclusion in the family. The son says, well, I'll go back and I'll work for my father like one of his servants. But the father says, no, you are part of the family. And so that sense of being alone, of being isolated, of not belonging, it is one that the father confronts immediately and says, no, you belong. You are part of this family. And so we'll talk about what it means that God includes us, not just in a one-to-one relationship with God, but in God's family. And then finally, of course, the father provides a party. And the party is one, again, that upsets the older brother. But another deep voice that we have within us, one that you'll know that I love, the theologian Walter Brueggemann. He says that one of the voices that is used to set us against each other, to undermine us, to control us, is the voice that says there is not enough, that we must compete with each other, that God cannot provide. But here the father says, we have enough. And so the voice that says, I am anxious, life is precarious, I cannot trust that God will look after me. The father sets this great feast for the son, not just as a celebration, but as a demonstration of the father's generosity. So in our tradition, we sometimes talk about knowing God with our head and then knowing God with our heart. And I think that language helps when we think about this idea of thinking fast and slow, or the idea that there is a part of us that is deep and instinctive. And it's when these messages reach deep inside us and begin to change us that we then begin to change. The Father loves us unconditionally. The Father values us. The Father gives us authority. The Father makes a place for us where we belong. And everything that the Father has is ours. These are really, really powerful and deep messages, not on an intellectual level, but they form us and shape us as a person. I just want to go back to the Rembrandt picture very, very quickly, because we have 1 minute. In the back is probably the other son. I don't know what you think. In my mind, he's kind of looking at us and going, you see? But what the older son has not learned is how to live in his father's love. For those of us that are part of the church, maybe that is the message too. How do we love the way the Father loves? I have to stop now. But don't worry if you're thinking it's a hurried end, because we're going to come back to all of those gifts of the Father week on week, and hopefully we will receive them.